What's up guys, Moses Bygate-Smith here, back with another video with Power and Prowess, and today I'm bringing you guys part 2 of the Plyometric progression series. So in the last video I covered over 2 sort of main phases that I use to dictate the progressions that I use for plyometrics, that being using extensive to build a capacity for the tissues with training the likes of the stretch shortening cycle, that is what is the characterization of plyos, and then moving on to more of an intensification phase with the plyometrics, which was characterized by higher impacts, lower volumes, and just overall higher intensities. Now, what I'm doing with this part 2 video is I'm diving in a little deeper towards the specificity of progressions within those phases themselves. So starting off with the extensive phase, there are loads and loads of different variations and approaches that you can take within that phase itself, much like you can do so with the intensification phase. The main one that I like to start off with the extensive phase is force absorption. Now, contradicting to the name, it's not actually force absorption, it's more so your ability to decelerate, and in order to decelerate you have to apply force into the ground in order to come to a halt eventually. But it is just going to be labeled as an absorption phase for the sake of understanding. Now, when looking at jumping in particular, you've got 3 main phases of the jumping, which is also similar to that of any sort of lift traditionally. So you've got the eccentric phase, the amortization phase, and you've got the concentric phase. So what that essentially means is the eccentric phase is when you're loading up and you're about to take off. The amortization phase is the transitioning time between the eccentric and the concentric is simply the upward velocity or the takeoff. And the way that this phase works in particular is you're mainly just isolating the eccentric phase. So what that would look like exercise-wise is stepping off of a high box or any height of a box and simply landing on the ground without a counter movement jump. So this is just working on the landings, being able to decelerate the forces associated with your mass and of course gravity. And essentially what this is teaching you to do is not only reinforce correct landing mechanics, but it's also teaching you to be stiff in one of the 3 phases of the jump. Now, stiffness is attributed to your ability to be elastic and to reproduce force. So essentially what you're doing is you're becoming more efficient at loading up energy, and then eventually what will be progressed later on will be your ability to start to coil up this energy and then release it. Now, after you've undergone an absorption phase within the extensive block, what I like to move on to after that is a form of bilateral slow stretch shortening cycle low impact jumping. Now that is a mouthful and there's a lot of components to that. What that simply means is jumping off of 2 feet, hence the word bilateral. And then with the slow stretch shortening cycle component, that just refers to how quickly you jump. So as I spoke about, you've got the 3 phases, eccentric, amortization, and concentric. And pretty much what the stretch shortening cycle is the intertwining of all 3 of those phases of jumping. And the word slow simply just means the rate at which you do the stretch shortening cycle. So a prime example would be just a simple rebound squat jump. It's relatively fast in nature, but relative to other plyometric exercises that are out there, it is actually slow in comparison. An example of a slow stretch shortening cycle compared to a fast stretch shortening cycle would be seen in the likes of a dunk, for example, or a broad jump. It is powerful in nature, as I just spoke about, but when you compare it to fast stretch shortening cycle actions, which includes the likes of sprinting, pogo jumps, depth drops, even high jump, they're actually a lot slower in comparison. So that is what is meant by slow stretch shortening cycle. And the low impact side of things simply comes from the amount of forces that are associated, particularly on the eccentric portion of the movement. So a low impact jump would be attributed by the likes of sort of lower landings from achieving slightly lower peak velocities, whereas higher impacts you'd be looking at a lot greater peak velocities. You'd be looking at things like a running approach vertic, where you're getting up as high as possible, and then on that landing, of course, you've got the forces associated with your mass and gravity upon the landing. So that impact is regarding the impact on your body. Progressing from there, what you would eventually move on to is essentially the same thing. You would again do the bilateral low impact work, but then you'd be working on that in a fast stretch shortening cycle manner. So moving away from a rebound squat jump, you would be looking then at pogo jumps, even skipping. These are low impact relative to the other activities within plyos that you can do, but you're working them at slightly faster rates. So the emphasis moves more towards lower ground contact times, so getting off of the ground as quickly as possible. Then, when you move away from there, you actually drift towards the intensification phase. Now that you've built up a resiliency within the tissue, you then move towards more of your intense activity, which is categorized by, as I mentioned, the higher forces associated upon the landings. Now, one thing, sorry, I did forget to mention is that you can progress the phase. So once you've done the bilateral slow stretch shortening cycle low impact work, you can also do unilateral in the same manner. So once you've worked on your 2-foot work and rebound squat jumps, you can then work on your single leg stuff. So that can look like a rear foot elevated Bulgarian split squat jump. You can even just do basic single leg squat jumps in place. And then same for the fast stretch shortening cycle phase, the low impact extensive component of the block. You can do things like single leg pogos, mini hurdle hops, stuff of that nature. In the intensification phase, you follow a pretty similar progression. You start off with bilateral work, but I like to start off the intensification phase with sort of approach that takes away the impacts to start off with, and then eventually the progression will be towards the higher impacts. So what this means is you're simply going to be working on plyos that have low forces upon the landing, but still high peak velocities. So what this would look like is a box jump, seated box jump, pretty much just any variation of a box jump, provided that when you descend off of the box jump after the jump, you are getting off very, very cautiously. Now, the reason why it's low impact is because when you start from the ground and you jump up onto a box, you're essentially jumping to your peak velocity and then you're staying there, because where your feet land on the box is where your peak velocity is, essentially. Whereas if you compared that to a running vertical jump, you would have the fall and then the landing as the impact. So that's the difference between low impact and high impact. So this is an intensification, bilateral, slow stretch shortening cycle, low impact block. Now, what you eventually do to progress from here is, as I just mentioned, you go into the more high impact work. So you'd have running vertical jumps, standing vertical jumps, stuff of that nature. The way that you would then progress from there is you would actually start to work towards unilateral work. So much like I skimmed on in the extensive block, once you've done your sort of your intense low impact bilateral work, you would do the same in a unilateral manner. So in a low impact block, you would be looking at pretty much the same thing: single leg box jump, and then as you move into the higher impact stuff, you'd look at single leg approach vertical jumps. You can even do power skips, and these are all characterized by slow stretch shortening cycle. Now, just while I've brought that up, as we move further down the progression continuum, you would then look at doing very similar stuff, but in a faster stretch shortening cycle manner. So this is where you start to look at doing depth drops if you're looking at your bilateral high impact fast stretch shortening cycle work in the intensification phase. And then when you move further down, you would look at doing obviously unilateral work within that. So that would look like single leg bounding, stuff like that. And then there is a final progression to this, and that progression is doing still intensification based work, but it's almost like an intertwining of both the extensive and the intensive phase. So what this would look like is doing intense high impact plyometrics, but with lots of volume. So the extensive phase is characterized by more reps and or more sets. So this would mean that you're performing your higher intensity work just with higher volumes. So what this would look like, a really, really common one is bilateral hurdle hops, where you're simply rebounding off of the ground and jumping over each hurdle being set at a relatively decent height. And of course, you can play around with them as well. They're typically done with faster stretch shortening cycles, very common for the likes of sprinters and jumpers. And that's basically it. There you have it. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can manipulate within this as well. I've just dove into the complexities of how you can progress it. This is the approach that I take. In my opinion, it makes the most sense from a logical standpoint, and there's a lot of research that is to back this approach that I take as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If there are any questions surrounding what I've just covered, just leave a comment below. But yeah, as per, subscribe if you aren't already. Leave a like, comment something else if you want to, give me some feedback, and yeah, stay tuned. Cheers, guys.